Iconic Christian singer and songwriter Rich Mullins was a legend, beloved for songs like Awesome God, Step by Step, and Elijah. But beyond the music that filled churches and concert halls for over a decade, there was a far more complicated story, one of poverty, alcoholism, broken relationships, and a restless soul who never quite fit in anywhere. This is the life and tragic death of Rich Mullins. Rich Mullins was born Richard Wayne Mullins on October 21, 1955, to John and Neva Mullins in Richmond, Indiana. His father was a tree farmer, a hard and classically masculine man who struggled to connect with his sensitive, artistic son. His mother's family were birthright Quakers, and those roots in peace, simplicity, and social justice would shape Rich's worldview for the rest of his life. Rich Mullins grew up in a household where he never quite felt like he belonged. He was an oddball from childhood, often at odds with his hard-edged father, who had no patience for his son's artistic temperament. Rich's father was verbally harsh, and no level of success Rich ever achieved seemed enough to earn his approval. That wound ran deep, and Rich carried it for the rest of his life. Rich's longing for unconditional love, the kind he struggled to receive at home, became the engine behind his most powerful lyrics. Rich found his escape early. By his own account, he had begun playing hymns in four-part harmony before he could properly speak, learning at the knee of his great-grandmother as she sat at the piano. His father, to his credit, recognized the talent and made sure Rich received formal classical piano instruction during his elementary school years. It was one of the few things his father did that Rich seemed to look back on with something close to gratitude. Music became Rich's identity in a household where everything else felt uncertain. He accompanied a touring youth choir called New Creations while still in junior high school. By high school, he was performing and composing with a touring offshoot group called Children of Light. Even then, the contradiction that would define him was already evident. He was gifted beyond measure, but deeply insecure in ways that no applause could fix. After graduating from Northeastern High School in 1974, Rich enrolled at Cincinnati Bible College. He worked in a parking garage to pay for school, and from 1975 to 1978, served as the music director and youth director at Erlanger United Methodist Church in nearby Kentucky. He considered his music a hobby at this point, not a calling. He was simply a young man trying to hold things together, one odd job at a time. During his college years, Rich formed a band and later joined Zion Ministries, performing with a group that went simply by Zion. While working with the ministry, he wrote a song called Sing Your Praise to the Lord. It seemed like just another song to Rich, but it would change everything. In the summer of 1981, a copy of the Zion album found its way to the management team of Amy Grant, who was already a major force in Christian music. They were immediately struck by Sing Your Praise to the Lord, and decided to record it for her upcoming album, Age to Age. The song became a massive hit on Christian radio, and almost overnight, Rich Mullins had a name. Mike Blanton, an advisor to Grant and founder of Reunion Records, signed Rich to his first publishing and artist deal. Rich relocated to Bellsburg, Tennessee, near Nashville, to begin his professional recording career. He was still barely comfortable with the idea that music was supposed to be his life's work. But the door had swung open, and there was no going back. Rich's self-titled debut album came out in 1986, followed by Pictures in the Sky in 1987. But it was his third album, Winds of Heaven, Stuff of Earth, released in 1988, that transformed him from a respected songwriter into a genuine phenomenon. It featured a song called Awesome God, a bold, thunderous declaration of faith that felt nothing like the polished, safe Christian pop of the era. It became one of the most sung worship songs of the 20th century, covered by everyone from Amy Grant to Hillsong United, and it remains inescapable in churches to this day. Yet even as Awesome God was bringing Rich to the height of his fame, he was quietly coming apart. He had long struggled with depression and alcohol, demons he never tried very hard to hide. He was twice engaged and twice the relationship dissolved, leaving him lonelier than before. As his biographer James Bryan Smith noted, Rich was a ragamuffin in every sense of the word. Someone who showed up at a friend's funeral drunk, who told concert audiences about his failures as readily as he told them about God's glory, who refused to pretend he had it all together. That refusal to perform a cleaner version of himself both endeared him to fans and created serious friction with the Christian music industry. Nashville didn't know what to do with a man who was barefoot on stage, unshaven, dressed in whatever he happened to have on, and more likely to preach about poverty than to shake hands at a label showcase. He had no interest in the machine. He would play enormous arenas one night and a tiny rural church the next, and it genuinely didn't seem to matter to him which was which. A close friend, Doris Howard, told Release magazine simply, "Nashville didn't own Rich, but then he cared nothing for the things of this world." Rich's complicated relationship with the music business came to a head when he made a radical financial decision that stunned those around him. He instructed his church elders to take control of his earnings from album sales and touring. They would pay him only the average American laborer's salary for that year and give the rest to charity. It was a decision rooted in his deep reading of St. Francis of Assisi, a figure he had admired since encountering the Franco Zeffirelli film Brother Sun, Sister Moon as a teenager. Rich didn't want money. He wanted to be poor in the way he believed Jesus had been poor, unburdened, and free. In 1991, Rich enrolled at Friends University in Wichita, Kansas, to study music education. He kept recording and touring even while attending school, releasing 2 volumes of a compilation called The World as Best as I Remember It in 1991 and 1992. He graduated in 1995 and, almost immediately, made a decision that bewildered nearly everyone in his orbit. He moved to the Navajo Nation in New Mexico to teach music to children on the reservation. Rich settled into a modest trailer near the reservation with his friend and fellow musician, Mitch McVicker. He formed a small music club for the younger residents, collected instruments for the children, and poured himself into a community that had little use for celebrity. When he was made unwelcome by the evangelical mission due to his theologically broad-minded beliefs, he simply turned his attention to the Catholic community on the reservation and began attending daily Mass. At the time of his death, he was deeply studying the Catholic faith and had not yet decided whether to formally convert, though many believe he was close. He had studied through the rite of Christian initiation for adults and told friends he wasn't sure exactly where he stood, but that he knew Jesus was worth following wherever that led. On September 19, 1997, Rich and Mitch McVicker were driving from Chicago toward Wichita on Interstate 39, heading to a benefit concert at Tabor College in Hillsboro, Kansas. Neither man was wearing a seatbelt, characteristic of Rich, by all accounts, a man who was simply not oriented toward self-protection and who had always lived with a kind of reckless openness to whatever came next. Somewhere north of Bloomington, Illinois, Rich's Jeep overturned. Both men were ejected from the vehicle. Rich died instantly. A passing semi-trailer truck, swerving to avoid the wreck, struck him. He was 41 years old, just a month shy of his 42nd birthday. Mitch McVicker survived, though with serious injuries, and would go on to continue making music in Rich's memory. The accident happened on a bright September afternoon on an ordinary stretch of highway, while Rich was on his way to give what would have been just another show for a cause he believed in. That, too, was entirely like him. His funeral was open to the public and drew a massive gathering at Whitewater Christian Church near Richmond, Indiana. He was buried at Harrison Township Cemetery in Hollinsburg, Ohio, beside his parents and his brother who had died in infancy. The man who had given away most of what he earned, who had traded Nashville for a trailer on a Navajo reservation, was laid to rest quietly, surrounded by the people who had known him longest. Michael W. Smith, one of the many artists who had long admired Rich, reflected on his passing. Rich was a gifted songwriter with an amazing heart for people. What really made Rich special was how undistracted he was with the things of this world. His was a heart yearning for God. Shane Claiborne, the activist and author, called him one of the most important people in the history of modern evangelicalism, a ragamuffin that our children and grandchildren need to know about. Rich Mullins was inducted into the Gospel Music Association Hall of Fame in 2014, 17 years after his death. A biographical film called Ragamuffin was released that same year, dramatizing his struggles and his faith with a honesty that he himself would likely have approved of. His music, raw, honest, theologically restless, and shot through with a genuine longing for God, has never stopped being sung. Awesome God alone has been recorded by hundreds of artists and remains a staple of Christian worship around the world. Not bad for a barefoot farm kid from Indiana who never wanted the spotlight to begin with. He once told a crowd shortly before his death that the best way to identify with Jesus was to identify with the poor. He wasn't speaking theoretically. He had already given most of his money away. He was living in a trailer. He was teaching music to children who had very little. In his own words, "The Lord is good, and his love endures forever." For Rich Mullins, that was always enough. In the final months of his life, Rich was also working on a musical called Canticle of the Plains, a retelling of the life of St. Francis set in the American Old West, collaborating with McVicker and a musician named Beaker. He had also laid down a set of rough demos for what would have been his next studio album. Those recordings would later become the Jesus Record, a posthumous release in which the Ragamuffin Band and various guest vocalists completed the songs Rich had left unfinished. It remains one of Christian music's most haunting documents, the raw sound of a man who knew exactly what he wanted to say, but ran out of time to say it fully. Rich Mullins had been nominated for 12 Dove Awards over the course of his career and never won a single one during his lifetime. He received one posthumously, awarded after he was no longer around to shrug it off. According to those who knew him best, he wouldn't have minded the losing streak at all. The industry's approval was simply not something he was chasing.